സ്ട്രക്ചറൽ ടെമ്പിൾസ് നോർത്ത് ഇന്ത്യയിൽ കാണുന്നത് ഗുപ്ത കാലഘട്ടത്തിലാണ്. 4th 5th centuries സിയിലാണ് നമ്മൾ ഫസ്റ്റ് ടെമ്പിൾസ് കാണുന്നത്. ടെമ്പിൾ സെൻട്രിക് വേർഷിപ്പും അല്ലെങ്കിൽ നമ്മൾ അഗമൈക് ട്രഡീഷൻസ് എന്ന് വിളിക്കുന്നത് നോർത്ത് ഇന്ത്യയിൽ ഈ ഒരു സമയത്താണ് വരുന്നത്. സൗത്ത് ഇന്ത്യയിൽ ഇത് പിന്നെ ഒരുപാട് ഇത് വെച്ച് കമ്പയർ നോക്കുമ്പോൾ ഒരുപാട് ലേറ്റ് ആയിട്ട് ആണ് കാണുന്നത്. 9th 10th centuries നമ്മൾ ടെമ്പിൾസ് കാണുന്നത്. ഇതും നമ്മൾ ഇൻസ്ക്രിപ്ഷൻസിന്റെ ബേസിസിലാണ്. അപ്പൊ ലാൻഡ് ഗ്രാൻഡ് കൊടുക്കുമ്പോൾ ആ ലാൻഡ് ഗ്രാൻഡിൽ നമ്മൾ റെഫറൻസസ് ഉണ്ട്, ഇതൊരു ടെമ്പിൾ ബിൽഡ് ചെയ്യാനുള്ള ലാൻഡ് ഗ്രാൻഡ് ആണ് എന്നുള്ളത്. 10th 11th century ഷ്രൈൻസ് ഉള്ള ടെമ്പിൾസ് നമുക്ക് സൗത്ത് ഇന്ത്യയിൽ കാണാൻ പറ്റുന്നുണ്ട്. സോ ഇതിന്റെ നോർത്ത് ഇന്ത്യയിലുള്ള ക്രോണോളജി സൗത്ത് ഇന്ത്യയിലുള്ള ക്രോണോളജി വെരി ഡിഫറെന്റ് ആണ്. നമുക്ക് കൂടുതലും ഷ്രൈൻ ബേസ്ഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള, കാവുകൾ ബേസ്ഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള അല്ലെങ്കിൽ റീഡിസ്ട്രിബ്യൂട്ടറി സർക്കുലേറ്ററി സിസ്റ്റംസ് ബേസ്ഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള റിലീജിയസ് ഫോർമേഷൻ ആയിരുന്നു സൗത്തിൽ കൂടുതലും കാണുന്നത്. ടെമ്പിൾ ബേസ്ഡ് മച്ച് ലേറ്റർ ആണ് നമ്മൾ വരുന്നത്.
കേരളത്തിലെ ടെമ്പിളുകളെ അതിന്റെ സ്ട്രക്ചർ, ഫിലോസഫി, ആർക്കിടെക്ചർ എല്ലാം കുറെയൊക്കെ ഗവേൺ ചെയ്യുന്നത് തന്ത്ര സമുച്ചയം ആണല്ലോ. ഓൾമോസ്റ്റ് 500-year-old document ആണ്. which means that, it was like a Wild West, unregulated kind of area for several hundred years before some kind of a structure was put in place, it looks like, in Kerala. What is the corresponding document for North Indian temples? Or because there is the sanctity or structure of temples in North India did not derive from Vedas, obviously. So,
but you do have other texts. You have texts like the Mayamata. You have texts like the Shilpa Shastras. You have texts like the Manasara. Some of these texts have been analyzed quite well and quite meticulously by Michael Meister, by Adam Hardy, by Professor Mahalakshmi, for instance. There's a lot of work on temple architecture. In fact, the temples of India have been largely divided into 3 different categories. So you have the Nagara version of temples in North India. Then you have the Dravida version of temples in South India. And these are very, very different. Their structure is also different. Here is a layout of a Dravida temple, for instance, which would be very different from a Nagara temple. And you do have several texts about temple architecture. And it's not only the Tantra Samuchaya. We have other texts like the Vastu Shastra Ratna, the Manishyale Chandrika, the Vastu Ratna Pradipika. So there's a large corpus of Vastu Shastra material which talks about from the 10th century onwards in South India, and from the 6th, 7th century onwards in North India, which regulated temple construction. Sort of not like the Wild Wild West, there was structure to it. And that is what you see with the Sanskritic Brahmanic works, that they're obsessed with classification, they're obsessed with order. And it's an order that has to be maintained. And that's something that you see throughout in Shastraic literature, in Dharma, whether it is Dharma Shastras or whether it is Vastu Shastra or whether it is Ayurveda, there's an obsession with classification and there's an obsession with structure.
What are these sources of dating Vedas, Upanishads, and so on? People keep throwing around dates like 1500 BCE, 1000 BCE, but there's no inscription, there's no rock formations, there's no plates. So how do you date these things is the question that
One is through linguistic analysis. For instance, I did mention about Panini's Ashtadhyayi. So when you have grammatical treatises, whether it is Panini's Ashtadhyayi or in the Tamil case, you have the Tolkapiyam, if it sticks to that kind of a grammar, then a lot of text can be, if it is in the structure which is given in Panini's Ashtadhyayi, then we can very surely say that these are texts which were written later. If it does not stick to that kind of grammar, then it was maybe written earlier. In the case of Vedas, you do have a linguistic analysis, particular words എടുത്ത് നോക്കിയാൽ ആ വേർഡ്സിന്റെ മീനിങ് എങ്ങനെയായിരുന്നു എന്ന് അനലൈസ് ചെയ്ത് നോക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ, കാരണം വേർഡ്സ് ഓൾസോ ചേഞ്ച് മീനിങ് വിത്ത് ടൈം. ലിംഗ്വിസ്റ്റിക് അനാലിസിസ് ഇത് ഒരു മെത്തേഡാണ്. അങ്ങനെ ഒരുപാട് കൈൻഡ്സ് ഓഫ് മെത്തേഡ്സ് ഉണ്ട് ലിംഗ്വിസ്റ്റിക് അനാലിസിസിൽ. അതുവഴി നമുക്ക് ഒരു പെർട്ടിക്കുലർ ഡേറ്റ് കൊടുക്കാൻ പറ്റും. പിന്നെ ഇതിന്റെ ഒരു കൾച്ചറൽ കോണ്ടെക്സ്റ്റ് ആണ്. എന്തൊക്കെ ജോഗ്രഫിക്കൽ മാർക്കേഴ്സ് ആണ് ഇതിൽ പറയുന്നത്, എന്തൊക്കെ സോഷ്യോ കൾച്ചറൽ മാർക്കേഴ്സ് ആണ് ഇതിൽ പറയുന്നത്. അപ്പൊ ഏത് സ്റ്റേജിലായിരുന്നു society? Is it talking about cattle rearing people? Does it have references to settled agriculture? ആ ഒരു രീതിക്ക് നമുക്ക് മനസ്സിലാവും. Does it have references to other civilizations? For instance, ഇപ്പോൾ ഒരു വർക്കിൽ മെസപ്പൊട്ടേമിയയെ കുറിച്ചോ ഈജിപ്ഷ്യൻ സിവിലൈസേഷനെ കുറിച്ച് റെഫറൻസ് ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ those civilizations have already been dated. അപ്പം വേദങ്ങളിൽ you have a reference to the Hittani and the Mitanni tribes. ഇതുപോലെ തന്നെ you have a reference from Iran, where you have a particular inscription about it's sort of a transaction, a deal between the Hittanis and the Mitanni tribe, where there is a reference to certain verses of not certain verses, certain words which are there in the Rig Veda. So that's from 1500 BCE. So since we do not have any inscriptional detail before that, one cannot assume that it is older than the evidence that we get from Iran. So ഇതുപോലെ multiple indicators വെച്ചിട്ടാണ് നമ്മൾ ഒരു particular indicator അല്ല, you have linguistic analysis being done, you have archaeological analysis being done. ഇപ്പൊ വേദങ്ങളിൽ ഋഗ്വേദ തൊട്ട് ഹോഴ്സിന്റെ റെഫറൻസ് ഉണ്ട്, ഇതിനകത്ത് ഫയർ ഓൾട്ടേഴ്സിന്റെ റെഫറൻസസ് ഉണ്ട്. സോ നമ്മൾ ആര്യൻ മൈഗ്രേറ്ററി റൂട്ടിൽ നമ്മൾ നോക്കുമ്പോൾ എവിടെയൊക്കെ ഹോഴ്സ് ബോൺസ് നമുക്ക് കിട്ടിയിട്ടുണ്ട്, എവിടെയൊക്കെ ഫയർ ഓൾട്ടേഴ്സിന്റെ എവിഡൻസ് നമുക്ക് കിട്ടിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. സോ ആർക്കിയോളജിക്കൽ എവിഡൻസ് വെച്ചിട്ട് മൾട്ടിപ്പിൾ മെത്തേഡ്സ് യൂസ് ചെയ്തിട്ടാണ് നമ്മൾ ഡേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. അല്ലാതെ വൺ ഫൈൻ മോർണിംഗ് വന്നിട്ട് 5000 വർഷം പഴക്കമുണ്ടെന്ന് പറയുന്നതല്ല. മേ ബി നമുക്ക് വി ക്യാൻ ഹാവ് എ ടോക്ക് ഓൺ ദ ക്രോണോളജി ഓഫ് ദ വേദാസ്. We can definitely think about it, because it's such a ഞാൻ ഇന്ന് പറഞ്ഞോണെങ്കിൽ എനിക്കൊരു 1.5 മണിക്കൂർ പറയേണ്ടി വരും ഓരോ കാര്യം വെച്ച്.
Next question is, this came earlier in the session. What are Brahmanas? I think you were talking of Vedas, Aranyakas, Upanishads. You talked about Brahmanas. Could you talk a little about Brahmanas?
Oh, definitely. So you have a set of text where you have certain precepts being laid out. One can definitely read them as commentary of the Vedas, but at the same time, there are also new kinds of philosophies being discussed there. So usually you have Brahmanas and Aranyakas being discussed together, because these are highly esoteric in manner. And not even the Dvijas, only particularly sections within the Brahmanas could have access to the Brahmanas and Aranyakas. They were very much part of a larger tradition of oral learning from the mouth of the Guru. And while you don't have the high philosophy of, let's say, the Upanishads in the Brahmanas, there are references to rituals, there are references to certain kinds of doctrines, there are expositions on the Vedas within the Brahmanas. So highly Brahmanic text, highly esoteric text, but again then the Brahmanas also help us in understanding the larger cultural meaning of the Vedic age, and also of the immediate post-Vedic ages.
There is some opinion that Mahisha Mandala is modern Mysore and Dashera is widely celebrated there. Any opinion on this?
Could be. Again, there are two schools, one which argue, and this is from the colonial time onwards. In fact, you have a certain ICS officer called H. Fleet, who puts forth this idea that Mysore is not Mahisha Mandala. So he has written an extended article on why Mysore could not be Mahisha Mandala. He argues that on the basis of Buddhist text and on the basis of Smriti literature, Mahisha Mandala is somewhere near Tripura, because there is a reference to a king in Mahisha Mandala who takes bath in Narmada and then goes to Tripura in 2 days' time. Now again, but he is again conflating the Tripura of modern day India with the Tripura which is mentioned in that particular, it's a Granthavari, in that particular Granthavari, when we do not know whether Tripura has had the same name for centuries. So one school of thinking which argues that it's not Mysore, but you also have several authors who have looked at the phonetic similarity of Mahishasura and Mysore, and have argued that the references to Mahishasurapuri, or references to Mahishamandala, or references to Mahishapur could have later been corrupted into Mysore. So you do have both evidence, you have evidence for both. Now, I would say that there probably is a very strong chance of Mysore being somehow connected with Mahishamandala. Whether Mahishamandala had a tribe which had a buffalo totem is something that I cannot say for sure, because we do not have inscription or historical evidence for it, other than maybe this iconographical references in on temple panels. So I'm not 100% sure, but there are inscriptions in certain temples, and even inscriptions in the temple which is built in the 18th century, which is in southern Karnataka, which has a reference to Mahishapur, that granite was brought from Mahishapur. So since it is Karnataka, there is a big possibility that this is brought from somewhere near Mysore. So there is a strong possibility, but I cannot say for sure that Mysore is Mahishapur. Maybe if we get more references, maybe I'll look up more references.
You talked about the distinction between the Varna tradition or the Varna concept and the Jati concept. And the Varna is obviously listed in so many Hindu scriptures at various points. What about the Jati concept? What is the current understanding of how it might have crept up into the Hindu system?
If you look at Smriti literature, there are references to Jatis, whether it is Manusmriti or Yajnavalkya Smriti or Narada Smriti. The whole concern is to make sure that Varnashrama Dharma remains intact. There are only two concerns for most of the Smritis. One is to control the sexuality of women. The next is to make sure that the Varnashrama Dharma remains safe. And you can see this even in your Vastu Shastra text. My MPhil thesis was on Vastu Shastra. And for me, when I started looking at it, I was under the impression that I am looking at texts of civil engineering. But once I started reading these texts, what I've understood is that if you look at Maya Mata, for instance, Maya Mata, I've done a chapter-wise counting of the shlokas. The lion's share of the shlokas, more than 60% of the shlokas, is to make sure that Brahmanas live in particular quarters of the city. Shudras live in particular quarters of the city. The Rajagriha is far away from where the Shudras live. It also makes sure that women are invisibilized by walls. Women are invisibilized by staying in the that portion of the house which is the darkest, which is the most cut off from the gates. So these are the concerns. So most of what you have in the Vastu Shastra is to make sure that Varnashrama Dharma is kept intact, and a large chunk of the slokas is also to reiterate the hold of the Kshatriya on land. So it constantly says that the king is the one who has ownership of the land. The king is the one who has to allocate land to people. So there are a lot of slokas on that. So coming back to your question of, so whether it is Shastraic literature or whether it is Smriti literature, if you're looking at Brahmanic literature, for sure you have reference to Jati, and the maintenance of the Jati system, and by extension the Varna system is a huge anxiety, despite the fact that the composers of these texts, as we have discussed today, Brahmanas themselves, they were engaged in multiple kinds of caste transgression. They were engaged in moving from one profession to the other. But at the same time, you have caste proscriptions and prescriptions becoming very, very important. Now, one of those scholars who has been very neglected from history and historiography is Ambedkar, who has argued that the whole Jati system, the whole Varna Jati nexus has emerged as a juxtaposition of endogamy on earlier exogamous communities. So the argument that he is trying to make here, and which is a rather important argument, And if you follow Suvira Jaiswal, there's a wonderful work by her. And the title of that work is Caste. I'd encourage some of you to look at it. It's very lucidly written. It's a set of essays. You can look it up on Google Books as well. So she, though she does not refer to Ambedkar, she has looked at how Jatis work using Brahmanic sources, and the evidence that she puts forth agrees to what Ambedkar is saying. So you have in Vedic literature a certain concern about marrying outside the Gotra. So you are not supposed to marry someone who belongs to the same Gotra or same Pinda as you. So you trace your ancestry for 5 or 6 generation and make sure that you're not marrying a cousin, or you're not marrying someone who could have been a progeny of your grandmother or your grandfather. So that is exogamy. And Ambedkar argues that what you have as exogamic practices are actually pre-Aryan practices, because several ethnological studies from various parts of India have suggested that if you look at tribal communities, they have a tendency to marry outside the immediate clan group within tribes, because there is a certain idea that within the tribe you have multiple clans, and in those clans you have an idea of sisterhood or brotherhood. So everyone who belongs to the clan is a brother or is considered to be a brother or a sister. So you don't marry within the clan, you marry outside the clan within that particular geographical context. And the history that we have is of pre-Aryan exogamy, which got absorbed into Vedic literature as well. And later on, when you have caste becoming rigid, when your varna becoming rigid, and when you have an apparatus which needs to make sure that people are put in particular positions, then you have endogamy being forced on an exogamic group. So whether you're looking at Brahmanic literature or whether you are looking at caste practices, there is a heavier punishment to people who practice exogamy than the ones who transgress endogamy. So one can argue that at the root of all of this is a gendered practice of endogamy, where you're controlling both men and women from falling in love with whosoever they want, and controlling the sexuality of people. And by controlling the sexuality of people, you're making sure that certain rigid structures stay as they are. In fact, several scholars from across multiple disciplines have argued that. And here again, I'll have to go back to Ambedkar and argue that in his Annihilation of Caste, he argues that the only feature that maintains caste as it is endogamy. Even if we have a move towards capitalistic structures, even if we have globalization, caste will remain the same if we do not dismantle the apparatus of endogamy, and time has proved him to be right. So historically, if we look at caste, that structure has been maintained as such because of endogamy. And whether we are looking at Sangam literature and post-Sangam works in the case of South India, or whether we are looking at Vedic material and later Vedic material, or Smriti literature from the North Indian context, what we see is that the greatest instructions or injunctions that these works put forth in terms of the production of a caste apparatus is on maintaining endogamy, A. B, of non-commensal practices, of not sharing food or not eating the food that is cooked by someone who belongs to a different group, or not sharing a meal together. The third practice was that of the idea of caste purity, of the idea that some caste were Dvija or twice born, and some caste were not Dvija. R. Sharma, in his work on the Shudras, for instance, argues that this community, Shudras, they were later integrated into the Brahmanic fold as peasants, as manual workers, and that is why they don't have a ritual rank. But again, when you look at the Shudras, it's a highly heterogeneous group. So one can also argue that it is through the mechanism of rituality, this emphasis on life cycle rituals that one person is supposed to do throughout his life, from the Pumsavana ceremony to the Namakarana ceremony, and then we do practice all of that still. So one is rituality, and the second is endogamy. Endogamy being more important than rituality, and that is why caste is maintained.